You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa.
All right, welcome. Welcome back, Brad, and welcome to our Sacred Sofa listeners. Hey. It is great to be back with you. And we've been talking about the 7 story plot lines of story. And here we are at our final plot line.
Final one. Yes.
I feel a little sad.
Yeah, I know.
Great ride.
Yeah.
But, all good things come to an end.
Yes.
So,
yes. Indeed.
We've chatted together through overcoming the monster, the quest, rags to riches, voyage and return, comedy, and we just finished talking about tragedy. And so now we've come to the final plot line, which is about rebirth.
Rebirth, yes.
Rebirth. And it got me thinking about something. So, Brad, that every time I hear the phrase born again, I think of how loaded those two words have become. Right. Yes. And you and I grew up in church. So born again.
Yes.
For some, it's a beautiful idea of renewal. And I love that. For others, it can be a bit of a trigger. So let's start with that.
Yeah, let's jump in there. You're exactly right. I've got even, family members who that's actually the distinguishing. There's 2 types of Christians. There's born again Christians, every other type of Christian, right? But
backsliders.
Yes, exactly. Backsliders. That's right. And it's interesting because that's actually where our conversation begins, because that term comes from a very specific story. We know that Jesus meets with a religious ruler at the time. His name's Nicodemus. And in their conversation, he tells Nicodemus, you must be born again. Now, it leads to some confusion on Nicodemus's part, but what Jesus is talking about there is not actually a religious label, but he's describing a very well-known plot line. And it's the way that grace sneaks into the middle of our story when you've hit a wall, so to speak. And so that brings us to the rebirth storyline. Now, Christopher Booker describes the rebirth plotline as the story of a person who falls under some kind of dark spell, whether it's despair or pride or blindness or prison, until an act of love or grace releases them into new life. So obviously, this is probably one of the most deeply Christian of all plot lines. Like, it's quite on the nose here. It's the drama of death and resurrection, you could say. But what's fascinating to me about this plot line, when you sort of break it down, is story always starts the same way. Unlike all the other plot lines that start maybe with adventure or conflict, this one always starts with captivity. So somebody in the story has got themselves stuck. So Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, and he's cloaked in reputation and certainty. And so he's come under the guise of night because he's scared about his reputation, doesn't want anyone to know he's talking to Jesus. But he's a scholar, he's a respected leader, he's a man of well-ordered theology, and that is precisely his prison. He's trapped in the story of what has always worked for him. And that's the irony of rebirth, is it doesn't begin when life falls apart. It begins when our old certainties stop working, when the script we've been living into, it no longer works or fits the truth of who we are. So some other great examples, the classic is A Christmas Carol, and we're coming up to Christmas, right? Scrooge, he's stuck. He's a greedy man. He mistakes money for meaning. And so he's a man stuck in his ways. Or the other big one, a lot of people love this movie. I've heard a lot of people throughout the series, Grace, tell me they believe Shawshank Redemption is the best movie of all time. Whether or not you agree with that, it certainly fits this plot line. The protagonist is Andy, and he's stuck in the monotony of prison. And it's interesting because his friend Red in the movie, played by Morgan Freeman, says this about prison walls. He says, first you hate the walls, then you get used to them, and after a while, you depend on them.
Wow.
And that's the captivity that we're speaking of. And it can be literal, like being in a prison, or it can be the thing that confines you, and that thing starts to feel normal. It feels safe, it feels
Mm.
comfortable, but it's really a prison. So, Grace, I can't help but wonder how many of us are stuck perhaps in stories that feel to us safe. We've come to depend on them, but they're small, they're constricting. Why is it that people, do you think, stay loyal to stories that are no longer serving us, whether it's in our relationships, beliefs, identities, something that's clearly stopped giving us life?
Hmm. I love those powerful examples you gave, Scrooge,
Mm,
Andy, and Shawshank. Very powerful examples. And yes, with the folks that I work with, sometimes folks do get stuck in their stories, stories they've created, identities they've been given, and it's often fear that can keep people stuck.
mm,
What they know is familiar, and the unknown is too scary.
mm,
Often it's unhealthy pride that's the prison,
mm-hmm,
a
mm-hmm,
belief that their way is the only way, and despite all other evidence, they can't or won't change the narrative. And so,
mm.
yes, we can get stuck in our stories.
Yeah, and that's fascinating, right? Like maybe the prison, the unhealthy story, whatever it is, feels less scary than the alternatives might be. But
Hmm.
how do you maybe help someone recognize that they're normal at the moment might actually be I don't know, a kind of captivity for them?
Hmm. Well, sometimes folks already know
Mm,
that it's not
right.
working, right? So they already know it's not working, but they don't actually know how to change the story or
Mm,
the stuckness. I think other times the belief is so ingrained, they believe if they just try harder, it will get better.
okay.
And then sometimes, even when they start to think there's something wrong, they blame themselves.
Mm,
Maybe they're doing it wrong.
uh,
And this then causes even more pain
mm,
because they're stuck, because even though they want to change, they're blaming themselves and how it's supposed to go.
mm,
And so our reflections times in our sessions can help them to begin to identify that what they thought was life-giving no longer is.
mm. That's great.
And then that itself is a catalyst for change.
Right, right. Yeah, and you know the beautiful thing about story, and we already talked a bit about this last week with tragedy, is it's such a disarming way to look at, you know, ourselves in the mirror and have
Mm,
perhaps, you know, sometimes when you're confronted with, hey, clearly this isn't working, that's a bit difficult, but story can help us. And where the rebirth plot line turns a mirror on us is interesting because with the other plot lines, they can make us feel powerful. We go out and we slay the monster, or we go
mm-hmm,
on a quest, or we're on a voyage and we come home wiser. But Rebirth asks us a bit of a harder question, and that is, are you sure you're authoring your own story at the
mm,
moment? Because
mm, mm,
sometimes we get stuck. It might feel to us like we're free, but we're stuck. And it's like the pen has to be surrendered before anything else can be written. And that's, again, the tension. It has to start with us finally beginning to admit that our own story or where we've written ourselves to has failed us. And so
mm,
with Rebirth, it's not about winning, it's about yielding, surrendering. And
mm,
they always, every Rebirth story has a moment of interruption. So not something the protagonist does, but it's like grace comes kicking in the door. And you know, for Nicodemus, it was he expected a late night theological debate, you could say, with Jesus.
mm,
But sort of grace breaks through to him through the absurd. Jesus says to him, you must be born again, which to Nicodemus just sounded downright silly. It's confusing, it's even ridiculous.
mm,
But it's an intrusion that plants a seed that later allows for his transformation. Again,
mm,
you can do this with our other two examples. Scrooge's awakening comes through, you know, he has a dream or a vision, or he comes through these ghosts that are visiting him. So again, it's an intrusion. And of course, Andy, if you know Shawshank Redemption, there's these little moments. He gets his rock hammer, and then he has this moment sharing beers on the rooftop, and then he plays Mozart for the whole prison. These are
mm,
intrusions where grace sort of ambushes the story, and suddenly it's like there's air in the room again. And so awakening, which is the second part of the rebirth story, there's always captivity, then there's the awakening, and it's never earned, it's just received. It's when the old story starts to crack and light can leak in. So
mm,
Chris, I know
mm,
you've talked about, I think anyway, about the power of interruption before. Why does transformation so often require some sort of disruption first?
Mhm. Now, this is cliche, but it's true.
Mm-hmm.
If it ain't broke, then don't try to fix it.
Right,
Right?
right.
If something is actually working for you, then there's going to be no awareness that change is needed. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked in previous episodes about, dramatic, traumatic things like addiction. Right. And we
Mm.
talk about rock bottom experiences.
Right.
Those are the interruptions. It's like,
Yes.
whoa, whoa, whoa. This is in an even greater way of knowledge and awareness that this is no longer working. So
Mm.
if something's working, we're not going to really be inclined to make any changes. Disruption is actually the catalyst for the possibility of transformation.
Mm.
It shakes up that status quo and then creates space for us to re-envision a new
Mm.
path and the new opportunities and possibilities.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. And when grace finally breaks through, whether that comes via love or beauty or facing a hard truth, what
Hmm.
does that usually feel like for someone who's maybe been numb or feels stuck?
Mm-hmm. I believe it can be a combination of terror, nervousness, excitement, relief, and even
Mm.
hope.
Mm.
What one knows for so long has now shifted dramatically, and that can be scary.
Mm-hmm.
But with love, care, and support, hope can then start to blaze a trail to what's new, transformative, and to what's
Mm.
beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in rebirth stories, there's always the three movements. I've alluded to two of them. So the story always starts with someone in captivity, and that we can do some reflection and see where that's true in our lives. Then there's the moment of awakening, something
Mm,
that a disruption, and then comes the final act, which is release. And it's interesting in Nicodemus's case, he actually disappears for the most of the rest of John's gospel.
mhm,
But when he shows up later, it's fascinating. It's clear that he has become free from his theological prison, because he shows up actually after Jesus has been crucified in the day, and he's carrying like a king's worth of spices and burial
mm,
spices for Jesus. So,
mm,
it's sort of a quiet story, not on the nose at all, but all of a sudden we see Nicodemus meeting Jesus covertly at night. He's scared, he's ashamed, he's worried about his reputation, to
mhm,
in the day he's become free. He's no longer
mm.
scared about his reputation being hurt. um, Christmas Carol, we obviously know Scrooge has a complete transformation of character. He wakes up, he's laughing, he looks like a wild man, he's a man resurrected. And Andy, of course, he has to crawl through this filth and emerges in the rain. He's
Mm,
arms open, baptized in freedom, you could say. So release is what happens when you stop clutching control and start trusting grace. And so it's more of a reminder for us uh, that we need to surrender.
mm,
So, Grace, what makes, like, surrender is such a terrifying word? It has
mm.
connotations of giving up, but what makes it so terrifying for us, even when clinging to something else is exhausting and not working?
I love how you said that. It's like the thing about release and surrender is you're releasing control. And
Mm,
we spend the majority of our lives trying to seize, hold on to, and
yes,
entrap control, right?
right,
Like, what
absolutely.
is anxiety? The loss of control. And so
Mm,
we
mm-hmm,
spend most of our lives trying to hold on to things. And so the idea of release and even surrender is really, really, really hard.
mm.
Relationship coach Chantel Hyde calls it the bulldog syndrome. And I love
Oh,
this. I share this often with clients. Sometimes we can be like a bulldog, holding on and on and on and on, right? Gripped in our
yes.
teeth. If you're playing tug of war with a bulldog, they're like holding on, holding on. And here's the thing, we're making zero progress,
Right.
zero progress. It's exhausting, but we don't know what else to do. We just
Mm,
keep holding on,
mm,
hoping for something different. But we're ultimately afraid to let go, and it's just as painful to keep holding on.
mm,
But then to have someone come alongside and ask the right questions. What are you waiting for?
mm,
What do you think would happen if you let go? And then to release is now freedom.
mm. That is so good. I love that because my dog's not a bulldog, but it certainly has bulldog syndrome. That's for sure. Always like it's just relentless, holding on, won't let go of a toy, makes zero progress. Oh, that's a great analogy to work with. Now, like a lot of things we talk about, Grace, there's an intellectual understanding of this, right? Like we can get in our head, okay, there are times I need to surrender. But how do we move from like getting it in our head to actually releasing, knowing? How do you get a person to go from knowing they're stuck to truly letting go?
So there's a couple of very important interventions that I use in psychotherapy. The first one is psychoeducation, and the second one is validation. And I'll explain. In psychoeducation, we're bringing cognitive, intellectual information to help the person get a framework of understanding of what they're going through, helping them see the building blocks to their beliefs and their behaviors. Okay. In validation, which is another strong and equally important therapeutic intervention, I'm hearing their beliefs and validating that it makes sense, at least for a time. I'm hearing that their fears also make sense.
Right.
And I say that to them, that makes sense, right? It's then that folks can begin to see that it's possible to safely make changes, because people won't change unless they feel safe to do so. And so both are really important interventions, the psychoed and the validation.
Yeah, it's interesting. You already alluded to this, Grace, but the nature of hope. And the Rebirth plot line is really ultimately one about hope. All rebirth stories end the same way, not with certainty, but it ends in this hope. And I particularly think of Andy. Andy leaves Shawshank in that movie. He leaves Red's still in prison. He leaves Red a letter. And it says, if you're reading this, you've gotten out. And if you've come this far, maybe you're willing to come a little further. And then he goes on to say, remember, Red, hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies. And I love that line because it's kind of the heartbeat of the Rebirth plot line. But to me, it's also the kind of the point of this whole series, taking people through all of these 7 plot lines, is hopefully to instill a sense of hope that maybe whether we're living in an overcoming the monster is something we have to battle, or we're living in a tragedy, or whatever plot line we're following or leading in our lives, the hope that we can still change, make changes. And for the Rebirth plot line, the story doesn't end in clarity. It's hope. It's that hope that whispers. For Red, he'd never seen the Pacific Ocean, and he hoped it was as blue as he dreamed it would be. And it's that sort of whisper to each of us. It might not be about doing more or trying harder. Maybe it's just loosening our grip on the story, letting the author write the rest. And anyway, that's been my hope for this series as we've come through to the end of this final plot line, that our listeners might go, you know what? I'm stuck in this plot line, or there's something I need to address or face or do, or in this case, maybe just let go of control. And hopefully it gives our listeners a sense of hope that we can have a better plot line. So, yeah.
I love that. The hope that I'm thinking about is the hope that we have that we're also not alone in our story. And we've talked about that throughout this series. Our stories are interwoven with each other.
Right.
And ultimately held together in the hands of the divine. Brad, this has been incredibly powerful, incredibly powerful series. We've had incredible reflection time. You've brought us some intriguing ideas to consider and wrestle with. Thanks for bringing that. Thanks for bringing all your thoughts of life and giving us the opportunity to explore them together. Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, same with you, Grace. It's been really fun exploring this. And again, having that therapeutic lens is so good, not only for additional insight, but real practical helps, as you think through, okay, how do I make this change, or how do I live into this storyline? It's just been so much fun chatting through them all with you, Grace. So thank you for that. And thank you to our Sacred Sofa listeners for your support. And we look forward to joining you next time. Take care, Grace.
Take care, Brad.